Hey guys, so in today's video I wanted to share some updates for MadLands that I've been working on. So I guess we'll just get straight to it. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is in the bottom half of the main sheet here. The first change we're going to be talking about is that the consistent thickness parameter now will properly adapt to the offset angle. So, in case you don't remember, the consistent thickness parameter was supposed to compensate for the fact that our individual lands are drawn as squares. So, if we have a map here and we have a circle drawn with this template, we can see that when we're at angles 0 degrees, 90 degrees, and so on, the thickness of this pattern is represented by the side of the square, like that, and when we're at angles 45 degrees, here, here, and here, that the thickness of this pattern is represented by the diagonal of the square, which is quite a bit thicker than the length. So this consistent thickness parameter was supposed to reduce the base sizes when the angles are at 45 degrees and such. So the base size is 8 at 45 degrees, whereas at 0 degrees it would be 11. And if we replace the code, we can see what happens here is that the base size at 45 degrees here and here is now smaller to make the thickness of this pattern more consistent all the way throughout. Now previously, if this pattern was ever to be rotated, for example, if we rotated it 45 degrees, we would consider this point here. So the point that was previously at angle 0 has now been rotated to be at 45 degrees. And previously, the consistent thickness parameter would still evaluate the base size based on the angle 0 degrees. But now what it does is it calculates the resultant angle based on the xy coordinates of the points that were rotated, and then evaluates the base size based on that rotated coordinate instead of the initial angle. So we could copy this over, but it won't look much different because essentially the code is supposed to be exactly the same, even though we've rotated it 45 degrees. Yeah, see, it's still the same. But that's a nice feature to have. And so the next thing I wanted to talk about is in this top section here. So this was initially designed just to be representing player lands, but essentially you could basically put any land here. Like, for example, we have assigned to, but we could have also put a land ID of some sort inside here, and it would just be a generic land that isn't tied to a player. But the ability to input neutral lands into here can come into play, and we can talk about that later on. But the first thing to notice here is that the attributes of these individual lands can be modified based on different attribute indices. So let's move this over here a little bit. So if we are in a situation where we want different attributes for the lands, we can just match the attributes that we want to the attribute index over in this table here. So, for example, if I want the land number 1 to have the base terrain of leaves, I just make sure that the attribute index of land 1 is set to 1. And then if I want land 2 to have the terrain type of forest, I can make sure land 2 has the attribute index of 2, so it matches this. So this can be very useful if you are needing different attributes based on the lands that you're going to be generating. And we can go into an example actually to see where this is useful. So this is a map that we've technically already looked at before. This is Weaving Woods, but this version is slightly different. The pattern was rotated slightly, so it now uses the map space a bit more efficiently. But let's take a look at how we can potentially use the changes in MadLands to update this map. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of the terrain generation section. Actually, I won't get rid of all of it. I still want to keep this first one. So let's generate this. So we can see that before the terrains come into play, that we can kind of see where the players are going to go. So the players at the orthogonal angles are going to be spawning like here, 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 and here, which would take, of course, the base terrain of leaves, whereas the players that would be spawning within the ring of trees would be spawning here, 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 and here, and those would take the terrain type of forest. So that's where the attribute indices can become useful. And so when we generate this map, we can see the result. Now, let's go back up to where we're generating the players here. So right now, we only have one configuration of this. So the if we go back into our template here, you can see that team 1 is going to be occupying the same 4 positions every single time. So it's going to be starting out at angle 0 degrees. So team 1 is going to occupy this position, and that position. And then team 2 is going to occupy these 4 positions every single time. Now, in order to add some randomness back in, so previously we had options for the player land randomizer, which is now just called the land randomizer because it doesn't necessarily have to only apply to players. But the typical way we would do that before is with location translation. And what I mean by that is if I wanted to start team 1 to occupy the next 4 positions, for example, start at 45 degrees and occupy 1, 2, 3, 4 over here, I could start this angle here at 45 degrees. And since all of the other lands after this are in reference to this, they would all get rotated as well. But the issue is that when we do this rotating, that the attributes of our lands don't match anymore. Because if we do this instead, we can run into a situation where, since the player land that was supposed to be spawning as leaves is now spawning as forest, is no longer the correct terrain. The normal way of randomizing lands using location translation is not going to work. Instead, we would prefer to keep the location of the land and the attribute of the land the same. We would just prefer to change who it's assigned to. And that's what I want to talk about next, is that the land randomizer now has another mode, which is called assignment shuffling. So basically, when we were working with the assignment shuffle mode in the land randomizer, we need to specify how many lands to include. So I have 8 lands specified, so it's going to use all 8 for every player. And for the assignments to shuffle, I want to shuffle all of them, so I'm going to go with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. That may seem a little redundant, but we can talk about later on how these can come into play when you're working with neutral lands instead of player lands, and you want to shuffle the assignments of some and not the others. But either way, we still specify the number of configurations to be 8, and then basically what the assignment shuffle mode is going to do is going to take these assignments and move them down by 1 index per time, per configuration. So it'll take these 8 and move them down 1, so that these would be the first 7, and then the one at the end would be moved up to the top. So that would be the first configuration, and then the second configuration would be similar to that. It would move everything down 1, and then the one at the end, it would move up to the top. And in a similar fashion, it would keep doing that until we got to 8 total configurations. So we'll reset it to the way it's supposed to be at first. And then we can double check our parameters here. 8-player random teams. And team positions is off. And I think we're good, so we can generate this and see what we have as our result. So we will copy this, replace the code that's already here, and let's see what our result map is. So instead of the first and second team occupying the same positions every single time, we can see what we have here. So players 1, 2, 3, and 4 are now all on one team, occupying this side of the map, and the rest of the players are now occupying the other side of the map. And then also here, we have a different configuration. So now first team is occupying the bottom of the map, and the second team is occupying sort of the top. So that's basically how the assignment shuffling mode works. And we can go into a bit more detail later, because if we think about it, we're not actually changing a whole lot here when we're shuffling the assignments. Basically, the map is going to play out relatively the same way, regardless of what orientation the players take. So the next example we're going to take a look at is going to be a situation in which assignment shuffling would actually have a pretty significant impact on the way the game is played, depending on which player ends up where. But first, we need a little backstory. So this map is called Duopoly, and back in the day it was used for some tournaments. And basically what it looks like is there are 2 main lands that contain extra gold on the map. So we have this one over here and this one over here. And these lands spawn very independently of the player lands. So we can run into a situation where, for example, in this situation, we have the gold between the flanks on opposing teams. But we could also run into a situation where, for example, here, we could have it between the flank and pocket of the same team, and similarly here and here. So that's how it works. But since these lands spawn independently of the players, since random placement was the only option for player setup back then, we could potentially get into a situation where a player could potentially spawn right on top of where this neutral land is supposed to be, and will start to squish it a bit. So that's kind of a problem in some cases, where it can really reduce the amount of gold that ends up extra on the map. See, like this, there's almost nothing here. So let's try and think about what we can do to try and recreate this map using some more advanced methods that we have available to us now. So here we are back in MadLands, and what we're going to do is, instead of using a total of 8 lands, we're going to use a total of 10. So 9 and 10. So 8 of these will be assigned to players for a 4v4 situation, and then 2 of them are going to be neutral lands. So we'll just drag this down. And so the first 4 lands are going to be assigned to team number 1. The 5th land is going to have a land ID of 1. The next 4 lands are going to be assigned to team number 2. And then the 10th land is going to be similarly land ID 1. So we need to adjust the angle increment slightly so we can have room to have everything. So increment of 36 would do that. Let's increase the radius a bit. And then, just to make it a bit more random, so all that does is affix it to a bit more of an irregular pattern to make it feel a bit more natural. And then we're going to adjust these angles slightly. So the 36 is going to be plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, and then when we go to land ID 1, we're going to be minus 15, minus 15, plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, and then minus 15. So basically all that does is the land here and here are going to be representing where the gold is going to be spawning. And we just reduce the distance between the gold land and the nearest player so that these two, which are going to be players, are going to be a bit more of a consistent distance compared to the players here and here. So besides that, we're also going to need to define some attributes. So for the first set of lands, we're going to have the terrain type be grass, have the number of tiles and the base size and the base elevation. And we want the player lands to have this. So we'll have the player lands have attribute index 1, while the neutral lands we're going to have attribute index 2. And then for attribute index 2, so those are going to be fewer tiles with terrain type dirt 2, base size is smaller, and it's not going to be at an elevated. And it's not going to be elevated like the player lands would be. So let's take this code and we'll paste it into a sample map. Okay, so what we're looking at here is we have players 1, 2, 3, and 4 all on one team. We have the rest of the players on the other team, and now we have our gold lands here and here, which are now in between the two flanks. So let's see if we can use the land randomizer to shuffle the assignments to give a bit more variety to this map. So in the land randomizer, we will say we want to look at 10 total lands, and we want to shuffle the assignments of only the players, and we want to keep the neutral lands in the same spot. So lands 1 through 4 are going to be shuffled, as well as 6 through 9. So we're going to include 1, 2, 3, 4, but then we're going to skip 5 and go straight to 6, 7, 8, and 9. So basically what that means is that when we're choosing to shuffle assignments, we're going to shift it down but exclude the ones that we're not going to shuffle assignments with. So that means that team 1 is going to be shuffled down to here, and then team 2 is going to be shuffled over to here, skipping these neutral lands because they're not included in our list of assignments to shuffle. So it's going to keep doing that until we have 8 total configurations, but let's reset it to what it's supposed to be initially. And then for good measure, we will include team positions as well. So default team positions, and then based on this, the land randomizer is going to be smart enough to determine which assignments are going to be assigned to players and then which are going to remain neutral. So 8-player team positions, and clear this up, and then I think we are good, so we'll generate this. And then copy it over to our sample map. And let's take a look at the code here for a second. So basically, since the player assignments are going to be the ones that are shuffled, we have those inside the if statements that are going to be determining which configuration is going to be determining which player gets assigned where. And since the neutral lands are not going to be randomized, they can remain outside of this if statement to save a bit of code. So if we generate our map here, so here we have our map, and we have to keep in mind that since we use the default team positions, it means that's warm colors versus cool colors. So that means red, yellow, purple, and orange are going to be on one team, and then blue, green, teal, and gray are going to be on the other team. So instead of the way we had it initially set up, where the gold piles would be between the flanks of opposing teams, we can see that the red player and the yellow player are on the same team, and the gold piles between them. And let's do another generation. And now we can see that the gold pile in here is now between the opposing flanks on the teams, here and here. And then we can generate again. And now we can see that the warm colors are now here with the gold pile between the flank and the pocket of the same team. So since these lands are all still being very precisely placed, we're never going to get into a situation in which a player could potentially spawn right on top of where the gold pile is supposed to be. There's always going to be a small degree of separation because we're placing our land so precisely. So what we just went through was my first stab at recreating the map, but the more I use this utility, the more possibilities I start to think of. So later on, I tried using a different method, which I think is quite a bit better. So we'll go through that next. So what we're going to do here is that instead of considering all 10 lands in the pattern at the same time, we'll consider the player lands and the neutral lands separately. So if we are considering we have 8 players and we want all of them to be equally spaced from each other, that angle increment would be 45 degrees. And so the next player land would just be at angle 0 plus the increment, and then the same way so that we have 8 players equally spaced out. So these 8 positions here, I'm just going to, instead of having them as formulas, I'm going to just paste them as values in the bottom slots. And then these are going to be representing where the players are. So team 1 is going to take up index the first 4 indices here, and then team 2 is going to take these. And then the top 2 slots, we're going to have our neutral lands. This one here. So when we're considering where we want the neutral lands to be, let's just say I want the first neutral land to be halfway in between the first 2 players. So it's going to be halfway between 0 and 45 degrees, which is going to be 22.5. And then for the second one, I want it to be directly opposite of the first neutral land. So it's going to be the first neutral land plus 180. So we can see where it created the neutral lands is right here and here, which is between the players. So let's go back into the land randomizer, and we're going to shuffle the assignments of the players first. And so that's going to be very similar to the way we did in the previous example, except now the player lands are starting at index 3 and going through 10. So 3, 4, 6, 9, 10. So we're set to assignment shuffling, and then the header here says player assignments. So we're going to match that up with the player assignments header there, and then we'll clear all the lands first and then generate. And we can see we have randomized the assignments for the player spawn locations in this if statement, and then the neutral lands are still fixed at the coordinates we specified later on. But let's just say, for example, that we didn't want these 2 gold lands to spawn in the same place every single time. So let's just say, for example, that if we were to offset this starting angle by 45 degrees, that would put it directly between the next 2 players. And if we rotate it by an additional 45, it would put it between the next two players. So this is a good example of where we could potentially use location translation, which is going to be applied to the first two neutral lands. So we will say we want to include two lands at angle 45 degrees, and number of configurations is going to be 4. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to take the first positions of the first two lands and then translate them each 45 degrees until we have 4 configurations, so that the location of the gold lands is not going to be the same every time. And so instead of in the player assignments header, we're going to put it in the one that says neutral lands. And we'll generate this. Now, team position's got to be turned off if there's no players involved. Generate this. And we can see here, it randomized the position of the neutral lands. So what we'll do here is we'll take the code for the player lands and exclude the neutral lands it generated here. We'll go back in here. We will replace the code for the players, and then we will then take and replace the code for the neutral lands also. So these are independently randomized so that when we go and generate, you can see that the location of the gold piles is also going to be randomized. And it's not going to spawn in the same place every time. So I just thought that this was a good example of how the different aspects of MadLands can work together to create some pretty interesting maps. And I think that's about all I have to say for this video. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.